Thomas Bennett, a respected art dealer from London, boarded the morning flight to Paris with a leather briefcase containing his most important documents. The cabin smelled of fresh coffee and expensive perfume as passengers settled into their seats. Thomas adjusted his grey suit and placed his briefcase carefully in the overhead compartment. He noticed the flight attendant, Victoria, moving efficiently through the first-class cabin. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her uniform was perfectly pressed. She smiled warmly at an elderly couple as she poured their champagne. "Good morning," she said to a businessman across the aisle. "Would you care for a pre-flight drink, sir?" Thomas waited patiently, watching as Victoria served everyone around him. He caught her eye twice, but she quickly looked away both times. 20 minutes passed, and while other passengers enjoyed their drinks, Thomas remained unattended. "Excuse me," Thomas said softly, lifting his hand slightly as Victoria passed by for the third time. Victoria turned with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. Could I have some water, please?" Thomas asked politely. "Of course," Victoria replied, but continued walking without stopping. 5 more minutes passed. Thomas felt his throat tighten with frustration, but kept his expression neutral. He had experienced this type of treatment before. As the only black person in first class, he often had to work harder just to receive basic service. When Victoria returned to the cabin, Thomas tried again. "Excuse me, I'm still waiting for that." "Water." His voice remained gentle but firm. Victoria glanced at him briefly. "We're quite busy with pre-flight preparations. I'll get to you when I can." Thomas watched as she immediately served another passenger who had just signaled for her attention. He took a deep breath and counted to 10 silently. The older gentleman across the aisle caught Thomas's eye and gave him a sympathetic look. Thomas smiled back slightly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. When Victoria made another round through the cabin, Thomas tried a third time. "Excuse me," he said, his voice still calm despite the growing knot in his stomach. Victoria turned with a tight smile. "Yes? Could I have some assistance with my bag? It contains important artwork documents that I need to review before landing." Victoria looked Thomas up and down, her smile fading completely. Her eyes lingered on his hands, his face, then back, to his suit, as if trying to reconcile his appearance with his presence in first class. "Perhaps you should have booked help if you couldn't manage your own bags," she said loudly, her voice carrying through the quiet cabin. "Are you certain you're in the right section of the plane?" A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. Several passengers looked up from their magazines and devices. Some quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others stared openly, curious about what would happen next. Thomas felt his cheeks burn as he recognized the familiar sting of prejudice. Despite his successful career, his expensive education, and his tailored suit, to some people he would always be out of place in certain settings. The gentleman across the aisle frowned deeply and discreetly took out his phone, angling it to record the interaction. His eyes met Thomas's briefly, communicating silent support. Thomas straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Victoria. He had faced this situation many times before, in galleries, at auctions, in restaurants. Each time he had 2 choices: to react with anger, giving people the emotional response they sometimes hope to provoke, or to maintain his dignity. "I'm exactly where my ticket says I should be," Thomas said calmly, removing his boarding pass from his pocket and holding it up. His voice was quiet but carried a strength that made Victoria step back slightly. A flight attendant named Mark, who had been serving the other side of the cabin, approached quickly. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Thomas and Victoria. Before Victoria could respond, Thomas spoke. "No problem at all. I was just asking for some assistance with accessing my briefcase, as I need to review some documents for my meeting in Paris." Mark nodded and immediately moved to help Thomas. "Of course, sir. Let me get that for you right away." Victoria's face flushed as she turned and walked briskly toward the galley. Thomas thanked Mark and settled back in his seat, outwardly composed, while his heart raced beneath his calm exterior. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Thomas gazed out the window at the London skyline disappearing beneath the clouds. He thought about the important meeting waiting for him in Paris, a potential $1.7 billion global art exhibition that could change his career forever. He wondered if Victoria had any idea who he was or how much influence he wielded in the art world, but that wasn't the point. The point was that it shouldn't matter who he was. Every person deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect. The plane climbed higher into the sky, leaving London behind. Thomas took a deep breath and opened his briefcase. He had a meeting to prepare for, and he wouldn't let this incident distract him from what truly mattered. The golden Paris sunset cast long shadows across Thomas's hotel room as he sat at the desk, reviewing documents on his laptop. The Eiffel Tower stood majestically through his window, but Thomas barely noticed it. His mind was focused on the work before him. The Worldwide Heritage Art Tour had been his dream for 10 years. The exhibition would showcase African diaspora, artworks across 12 major cities. Paintings, sculptures, and historical pieces valued at $1.7 billion would travel the world, telling stories that had been ignored for too long. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes and took a sip of water. British Airways was his top choice as the official transportation partner. They had the routes, the experience with precious cargo, and the global reputation he needed. The contract would be worth millions to the airline, covering flights for artists, curators, and the carefully protected artworks over 2 years. His phone buzzed again. It had been buzzing all afternoon. Thomas ignored it at first, wanting to focus on tomorrow's important meeting with the museum directors. But when it buzzed 10 times in a row, he finally picked it up. 37 new messages, 15 missed calls. Thomas frowned and opened a text from his assistant, Emma. "Have you seen this?" she wrote. "It's getting thousands of shares." Emma had attached a link to a video. Thomas clicked it and felt his stomach drop. There he was, sitting calmly in his first-class seat, while Victoria, the flight attendant, spoke, down to him. The video captured her dismissive tone perfectly. "Are you certain you're in the right section of the plane?" The post already had 20,000 shares. The comments were filled with anger, with people sharing their own similar experiences. Thomas's name was trending online. "I didn't want this," Thomas whispered to the empty room. He wasn't interested in being a viral sensation. He had spent his career building relationships carefully, navigating the elite art world with quiet determination. Public attention like this could change everything. His phone rang. It was Peter, his business partner in London. "Everyone's talking about it," Peter said when Thomas answered. "The airline's public relations team must be having a meltdown." "I just wanted some water and help with my bag," Thomas said, his voice tired. "I didn't ask for all this." "Sometimes these things choose us, not the other way around," Peter replied. "What are you going to do?" Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the Paris evening. People strolled along the streets below, enjoying the warm night. Their lives continued normally while his had suddenly been thrust into the spotlight. He thought about his father, a man who had faced much worse discrimination with quiet dignity. "Sometimes the quietest voice makes the loudest point," his father used to say. Those words had guided Thomas through many difficult moments in his life. His phone buzzed again. It was an email from British Airways. Thomas opened it and shook his head at what he read. "Dear Mr. Bennett, we apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred during your flight today. Customer satisfaction. Here's our highest priority. As a gesture of goodwill, we have added 10,000 miles to your account." A form letter. Not even personally written. No acknowledgement of what had really happened. Thomas sat back down at his desk and stared at his computer screen. Tomorrow's meeting with the museum directors would be crucial for the exhibition. Should he mention the incident? Would they understand why it mattered so much? The exhibition was about more than just beautiful artwork. It was about visibility, about showing the world the depth and importance of African diaspora art. It was about challenging perceptions. In a way, the incident on the plane connected directly to why this exhibition mattered. Thomas opened a new document and began typing a response to the airline. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. "Dear British Airways, thank you for your response to today's incident. However, I believe you have missed an opportunity here. This is not about miles or misunderstandings." He paused, thinking about how to continue. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong somewhere because of how they looked. Thomas thought about the contract waiting to be signed. British Airways didn't know yet that they were being considered for a partnership worth millions. They didn't know who he was or what he could offer or take away. But that wasn't the point. The point was that it shouldn't matter who he was. Respect shouldn't be reserved only for those with power or influence. As the night grew later, Thomas continued writing his response. He wasn't seeking revenge or public embarrassment for the airline. He wanted something more meaningful, real, change. Perhaps this viral moment could become something important, something that would last longer than a day's outrage on social media. With new determination, Thomas turned back to preparing for tomorrow's meeting. This incident would not distract him from his life's work. In fact, it might just make it even more important. Thomas read the airline's message one more time. "We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred during your flight. Please accept 15,000 bonus miles and a $100 voucher for your next journey with us." Thomas put down his phone and walked to the hotel window. Morning light bathed the Paris streets below. People hurried to work, tourists lined up at cafes, and the world moved on. But Thomas couldn't move on so easily. This wasn't about free miles or vouchers. This wasn't even about him anymore. The airline had missed the point completely. His phone rang. It was William Porter, owner of the Porter Gallery in London. "Thomas, I've seen the video," William said. "It's disgraceful how they treated you. Everyone's talking about it." "I'm not interested in being a trending topic, William," Thomas replied quietly. "This isn't just about you," William said. "It's about what happens every day to people who look like you. What can I do to help?" Before Thomas could answer, another call came in. Elizabeth James, whose gallery in New York represented some of the artists for the exhibition. "Tell me what you need," Elizabeth said immediately. "The whole art world is behind you." Throughout the morning, Thomas received calls from museum directors, collectors, and artists. The story had touched a nerve in the art community, where diversity had always been a complicated issue. At noon, Thomas sat down for his scheduled meeting with the Paris museum directors. He had planned to discuss only the exhibition, but they brought up the incident immediately. "We saw what happened," said Director Francois Martin. "It was unacceptable." Thomas nodded. "Yes, it was, but I'd prefer to focus on our exhibition plans today." "Of course," Francois agreed. "But first, we want you to know that we have decided to withdraw our consideration of British Airways as a transportation partner for any of our museum activities." Thomas looked up in surprise. "That's not what I wanted. It's what we want," Francois said firmly. "We cannot partner with a company that allows such treatment of our colleagues." The meeting continued, but Thomas's mind kept returning to the growing situation. What had started as a personal humiliation was turning into something much larger. By afternoon, 3 major galleries had publicly announced they would no longer book British Airways for art transportation. Back in his hotel room, Thomas opened his laptop. His email inbox was flooded with messages of support, interview requests, and statements from art institutions. The incident had clearly struck a chord far beyond what he'd expected. Thomas began writing. Not an angry complaint, not a demand for punishment, but a thoughtful letter about dignity and respect in customer service. He wrote about the subtle forms of discrimination that still existed in prestigious spaces like first-class cabins, luxury hotels, and high-end galleries. "Respect should never be determined by assumptions about someone's identity," he wrote. "True service means seeing the humanity in every person who walks through your door." He didn't demand that Victoria be fired. Instead, he suggested the airline consider how their training might change to prevent similar incidents. He explained how genuine respect couldn't be taught in a one-day workshop. It required deeper cultural change. As evening fell over Paris, Thomas reread his letter. It was personal but not angry, firm but not vengeful. It asked for change rather than punishment. His finger hovered over the post button. Would this make any difference? Would the airline even care about his words when they were already facing public backlash? Maybe nothing would change. Thomas remembered his father sitting at their kitchen table, writing letters to local newspapers about injustices in their community. Most of those letters never received responses, but his father kept writing anyway. "Why do you bother?" Thomas had asked him once. His father had smiled. "Because silence is agreement, son, and I don't agree." Thomas pressed post and published his letter to his professional social media accounts. Within minutes, it began to be shared widely. His phone rang again. It was Emma, his assistant in London. "The airline stock dropped 4% today," she said. "And I've received calls from 3 news programs wanting you to appear tomorrow." Thomas sighed. "I don't want to be the face of this, Emma." "You already are," she said gently. "But you can control what you say and how you say it." After hanging up, Thomas looked out at the Paris evening. The Eiffel Tower was lit up against the darkening sky, beautiful and enduring. He thought about the exhibition, about all the artists whose work deserved to be seen and valued. This wasn't what he had planned for his Paris trip. But sometimes the most important moments weren't planned at all. 3 days after Thomas published his open letter, his phone rang while he was having breakfast at his hotel in Paris. "Mr. Bennett, the CEO would like to meet with you," said a formal voice. "Mr. Williams can see you tomorrow morning at our London headquarters, if that suits your schedule." Thomas agreed to the meeting. That evening, he flew back to London, his mind turning over what he would say to the man who ran one of the world's largest airlines. The next morning, Thomas stood before the tall glass building that housed British Airways headquarters. The lobby was all steel and marble, cold and impressive. A young woman met him at the reception desk. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming. I'll take you up to Mr. Williams' office." They rode the elevator in silence to the top floor. Thomas straightened, his tie as the doors opened. He had dressed carefully in his best suit, not to impress, but to remind himself of his own worth. Robert Williams' office had a view over London that stretched for miles. The CEO stood as Thomas entered, extending his hand. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and a tight expression. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming." They shook hands and sat in leather chairs by a small table. An assistant brought coffee and then quietly left, closing the door behind her. "I've seen the video, of course," Robert began, stirring sugar into his coffee. "And read your letter. Very eloquent." Thomas waited, saying nothing. "Victoria has been placed on leave pending our investigation," Robert explained. "We're preparing a public statement about the incident." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here for her job, Mr. Williams." Robert looked surprised. "You're not?" "No. Firing one flight attendant won't solve anything." "Then what do you want?" Robert's tone was cautious, as if expecting a large financial demand. Thomas set his coffee cup down gently. "Change," he replied simply. "Not just an apology to me, but a commitment to do better." Thomas reached into his briefcase and took out a folder containing several printed pages. He passed it across the table. "What's this?" Robert asked. "A proposal," Thomas explained, "for a comprehensive training program, focused on unconscious bias and respectful customer service, and a plan for using the arts to build bridges." Robert flipped through the pages, his expression changing from confusion to interest. Instead of demanding punishment or compensation, Thomas had outlined a detailed plan. The airline would partner with cultural experts to redesign their customer service training. They would sponsor art exhibitions that showcase diverse artists, and they would create a scholarship program for young people from underrepresented backgrounds who wanted to work in aviation or the arts. "Your flight attendant isn't the problem," Thomas explained quietly. "She's a symptom of something deeper, and firing her won't fix it." Robert looked up from the proposal, studying Thomas with new interest. "You've put a lot of thought into this." Thomas nodded. "I've had many experiences like the one on your plane, but I'm in a position now to actually do something about it." Robert turned to the last page where Thomas had outlined the costs. His eyebrows rose. "This would be expensive, Mr. Bennett." Thomas smiled slightly. "Not as expensive as losing the exhibition contract." Robert's head snapped up. "What exhibition contract?" Thomas explained about the Worldwide Heritage Art Tour, the 12-city global exhibition worth $1.7 billion. He explained how British Airways had been the leading candidate to be the official transportation partner. responsible for flying precious artworks, artists, and curators around the world for 2 years. That would be significant business for us, Robert said carefully. Yes, Thomas agreed. It would be. But several museum directors and gallery owners have already told me they won't work with your airline after what happened. Robert was silent for a long moment. Through the large windows, clouds moved across the London sky, casting moving shadows on the office floor. You could have just taken this contract elsewhere, Robert said finally. Why come to me with this proposal instead? Thomas thought about his father, about the quiet dignity with which he had faced much worse treatment than Thomas had experienced on that flight. Because real change doesn't come from punishment, Thomas said. It comes from education and opportunity. Robert closed the folder and looked directly at Thomas. I'll need to discuss this with the board. Thomas stood to leave. Of course, you have my number. As he walked toward the door, Robert called after him. Mr. Bennett, thank you for not making this personal. Thomas turned back. But it is personal, Mr. Williams. For me and for everyone who has ever been made to feel they don't belong somewhere. The question is whether you'll make it personal too. 6 months passed like a dream. Thomas stood at a glass podium in the grand exhibition hall of the Paris Museum of Modern Art. Golden lights shone down on the crowd gathered before him, artists, museum directors, collectors, and art lovers from around the world. The worldwide Heritage Art Tour had finally begun. Behind Thomas, a massive painting showed a young girl looking toward a bright horizon. It was worth over $2 million, but its value went far beyond money. It told a story of hope that had nearly been forgotten. Thomas adjusted the microphone and smiled at the crowd. Welcome to the opening of our exhibition, he said, a journey that will take us to 12 cities over the next 2 years. His eyes found the CEO of Air France sitting in the front row. The French airline had stepped in eagerly when British Airways lost the contract. Their CEO had personally called Thomas to promise that all staff would complete the training program Thomas had designed. I want to thank Air France for their partnership, Thomas continued. Their commitment to respect and dignity matches the spirit of this exhibition perfectly. The audience applauded warmly. News cameras flashed. This was the biggest art tour in a decade, with works valued at $1.7 billion traveling around the world. After the speech, Thomas walked through the exhibition, watching people discover the artworks he had spent years bringing together. The rooms were filled with wonder and conversation. This was everything he had dreamed of. Mr. Bennett? Thomas turned to find a museum assistant holding an envelope. This was delivered for you today. Thomas thanked her and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on simple white paper. The handwriting was neat and careful. Dear Mr. Bennett, you may not remember me, but I am Victoria, the flight attendant from your London to Paris flight 6 months ago. Thomas felt a small shock of surprise. He had not expected to hear from her again. After our incident, I was placed on leave. During that time, I had to face some difficult truths about myself. I realized I had treated you unfairly based on assumptions I made without thinking. I am writing to thank you for not demanding I lose my job. Instead of punishment, you asked for education. British Airways did implement many changes after your meeting with Mr. Williams. They hired a diversity officer and changed their training program. I decided not to return to flying. Instead, I'm now working with an art education program for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Your dignity taught me more than punishment ever could. Thank you for helping me become a better person. Sincerely, Victoria. Thomas carefully folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He had not written that proposal thinking about Victoria, but perhaps that was the most important change of all, one person seeing the world differently. He continued walking through the exhibition, stopping occasionally to answer questions or greet people he knew. British Airways had lost the contract, but they had made the changes he suggested anyway. Sometimes consequences were the most effective teachers. As Thomas watched people from around the world admire the artwork, he thought about how his father would have felt seeing this moment. James Bennett had not lived to see his son's success, but his quiet wisdom guided Thomas every day. One small stand for dignity had created ripples of change far beyond what Thomas had imagined. A young boy with bright eyes approached, looking up at Thomas with wonder. "Are you the man who made all this happen?" the boy asked. Thomas smiled and knelt down to the child's level. He noticed the boy's mother watching nearby, smiling proudly at her son's boldness. "I helped bring these artworks together," Thomas said gently. "But many people made this possible." The boy looked around at the paintings and sculptures. "But how did you do it? How did you get all these important people to listen to you?" Thomas thought carefully about how to answer. "By remembering that everyone deserves respect," he said. "And that speaking truth, even when it's difficult, can change the world." The boy nodded seriously, as if storing this advice for future use. Thomas stood up and continued through the exhibition. He paused before a small sculpture of a man with his face turned toward the sky, arms outstretched. The artist had captured a perfect moment of transformation, pain turning into strength. Sometimes the deepest wounds could lead to the most beautiful healing. Thomas had transformed a moment of humiliation into something meaningful, not just for himself but for everyone who would come after him. As night fell over Paris, Thomas stood by the museum window, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow, he would fly to Rome for the next opening. The journey was just beginning.